So today we're going to be very much talking around, and it's quite a hot topic at the moment, overpayments of carers allowance or carer support payments for those of you who are up in Scotland there. Okay, so you will get a copy of these slides. I do put links within the slides, so when you get a copy, if I suggest that you go and have a look at. And I can't lie today, there's some legislation in there and there's some regulations in there, you know, and there's all those things that I'm sure are going to make you very happy to read through. But I'll keep it to the bits that are relevant for you. So let's just get started, shall we? Right, so carers allowance and carer support payments. Okay, so one of the most prudent ways to avoid an overpayment is actually to have a really good understanding of the benefit itself. Okay, which is easier said than done. Not everyone has a passion like myself for reading all those little words and all those nooks and crannies about eligibility and entitlement. So just as a really quick reminder for everyone, carers allowance and carer support payment, it is the main benefit for carers. It's paid at a weekly rate of £81.90. There are no capital or savings limits. Entitlement is subject to really strict eligibility criteria, so very strict rules. And therefore, not everyone in a caring role will have eligibility to be paid this benefit. Okay. Underlying entitlement can lead to premiums, and it can lead to additions being paid and added to other welfare benefits. And the eligibility for carers allowance, with the exception of the earnings limit, is what is generally used by the Department of Work and Pensions and the wider benefit system to acknowledge that someone is in a caring role. There's no sliding scale of entitlement. You are either entitled to be paid the £81.90 a week or you are not. So the best way to avoid an overpayment is to really understand what these rules mean. Now, I've done some other sessions around eligibility for carers allowance. I've done it in quite a lot of detail. So it might be that you want to have a look at some of the recordings on the Carers UK website, or it might be that if there's enough demand, you know, that we run them again, or it could be that if you have a particular question, you just get in touch and we'll tell you how to do that as well. So really brief reminder as well, because this all leads to being able to prevent and avoid an overpayment. Okay, so you need to be eligible for carers allowance or carer support payments. You have to meet all of these following conditions, okay? You look after someone who gets a qualifying disability benefit. Remember, disability benefits are attendance allowance, disability living allowance, personal independence payment. There are a few other ones as well. So you've got child disability payment, adult disability payment if you're in Scotland. There's constant attendance allowance, and there's also industrial injuries, war pension schemes and things like that when they're paid in combination. You have to look after that person for at least 35 hours a week. So this is physically helping that person or time you spend keeping an eye on that person to prevent them from coming to harm. You have to be age 16 or over. You cannot be in full-time education. Full-time education is classed as being an education of more than 21 hours a week, unless your prescribed course of study prescribes that as full-time. And so there are some part-time courses that are classed as full-time because they're funded slightly differently. You cannot earn, if you're working, more than £151 a week after allowable deductions, and we're going to come back to that, okay? You must satisfy UK residence and presence conditions, and you cannot be in receipt of an overlapping benefit. The most commonly known overlapping benefit is the state retirement pension, for example. And as I've said, there's a lot of information on there, and I'm very happy to go over any of those in details, but it's not actually what today is all about. So I'm going to go back to that £151 a week, because this is the one eligibility criteria that has not only received a lot of press lately, but also is the most difficult and tricky one to actually understand. So what actually counts as earnings? Okay, so you can't earn more than £151 a week after allowable deductions. However, it's calculated in different ways. So if you are an employee, okay, so if you're an employee, i.e. you work for somebody else, then the £150 a week earnings limit will be any remuneration derived from employment. Okay, so you do some work, you get paid for doing that work. You are an employee. So this includes any wages you receive. So also statutory sick pay, statutory maternity and paternity pay are included in that. Any bonuses or commissions, including tips, is also included in that. Any holiday pay counts, and any payments made by your employer for expenses not wholly and exclusively and necessarily incurred in carrying out a job. Okay, and so that includes travel expenses to and from work. So any expense your employer pays you is counted as earnings. Okay, and in some circumstances, sorry, pay in lieu of notice as well, I've missed that one. Pay in lieu of notice is also counted as earnings because that's earnings for a period that you would normally have worked. Okay, so if you receive any pay, any bonuses, any tips, any commissions, any payments by your employer for expenses, any pay in lieu of notice, then that is all classed as earnings for carers allowance if you're an employee. There's another category. In some circumstances, rental income or income from share dividends is also counted as earnings. So I'm just going to hold that thought for a moment. Because what isn't counted as earnings? Okay, so any payment you receive as part of a redundancy scheme that is not holiday pay, pay in lieu of notice, so if it's your redundancy payment, for example, that is not earnings. Any occupational or private pension payment that you get does not count as earnings because that is not derived from an employer. This is a pension scheme that is being paid to you. Any payments towards expenses that are wholly, exclusively and necessarily incurred in the performance of employment, such as travelling expenses during the course of this work that your employer does not pay you. Okay, so if your employer doesn't pay you expenses, then you can look to see, can I claim these back from carers allowance? However, this does not cover to and from a single place of work. And I think it's probably important to make the distinction now that the way the carers allowance unit and the disability carers service in Northern Ireland look at earnings is very different to how HMRC look at earnings. Okay, so two very different organisations, two very different stances. And here again, in some circumstances, rental income or income from share dividends might not be counted as earnings. So the more eagle-eyed of you might have noticed, I said on my last slide that rental income and share dividends can be counted as earnings, but they can also not be counted as earnings. I've put some links to the regs and the legislation at the very last slide of our presentation today, but in essence, it is on a case-by-case basis that is decided by a Department of Work and Pensions decision maker. But the guidance says that if you can show that you have rental income from a single property and that property is purely as an investment, remember, there's no capital or savings limits for carers allowance, then it can be perceived that it is an investment and investment income is not counted. So it's not counted as earnings. If you have more than one property and you are therefore running what potentially could be a business, then it is perceived as you are running it as a business, which would be counted as earnings. Okay. Share dividend, again, it's very much set up about how do you receive these shares. You know, are these shares part of your remuneration package from your employer? So therefore your dividends are part of your wages, commission, bonus. Or is it that you have some shares, you know, you've bought these shares in a bank, they're an investment, then they would not be earnings. Okay, so it's very much a case by case. The decision maker will make a decision around whether they're going to be classed as earnings or not. But as it is a form of income, they have to be declared. Okay, so same as any occupational or private pensions, they're a form of earning. They have to be declared. They will not be counted as earnings towards those £151 a week earnings limits. Okay, so it's complicated, and I can see already that there's some questions coming into the chat box. I will answer some of these questions as I'm going through the presentation, and I'll come back to the ones that I don't answer. Okay. So just to complicate things just a little bit more, if you're an employee, it's important to note that the Carers Allowance Unit or the Disability Carer Service in Northern Ireland will not average over your earnings over 52 weeks a year. They will not do that. Okay. They take the payment over the period for which it's paid. Okay. And so that is the regulation, that is the Social Security benefit link, which will explain in more detail. I've picked out the relevant bit, okay, because to be honest, nobody really needs to be trawling through pages and pages of legislation unless you have to. And when we look into that Regulation 8, it makes it really clear that earnings, your net earnings, are calculated based on your pay cycle. So how often are you paid? Are you paid weekly? Are you paid 4 weekly? Are you paid calendar monthly? Remember, this is employees. Okay, so you're an employee. How are you going to get paid? When are you going to get paid? What is your cycle? Then a calculation needs to be carried out to make sure you are within the net earnings threshold for that weekly pay. So, for example, if you're paid weekly, they will look to see, have you been paid less than £151 a week? If you're paid calendar monthly, then your net earnings from your pay slip will be multiplied by 12 and divided by 52 to determine whether you are within the net earning threshold. Okay, so what they do is they take, there's 12 months in a year, they make it into a year, they divide it by 52 to get a weekly amount. Okay, so the monthly figure is currently £654.33 net. Okay, so that's a calendar month. So if your earnings per calendar month are less than £654.33, then you are eligible to be paid carers allowance. So note, these are net figures. Okay. As some of us are paid 4 weekly. So when the carers allowance or the carers disability service, what they do there is they multiply the net earnings you receive by 7 and then divide the result by the number of days in a period of pay that you have received. Okay, and then that brings it down to a weekly amount. Okay, so we're stuck. There we go. Okay. Not everyone, though, has a really nice pay cycle. Okay. Not everyone works the same number of hours. Not everyone is paid weekly or monthly or 4 weekly. So if you are known as someone who has fluctuating earnings, okay, so it could be that you work more hours 1 week than the other. It could be that your pay cycle doesn't fall nicely into one of those. It can be possible to have your earnings averaged out over a recognisable cycle of work or over 5 weeks. Okay. In some instances, it may be that they'll take, say, 13 weeks, which is a quarter, to calculate a weekly amount. However, and I'm a bit vague here, however, this is completely discretionary. If you do not fit into a recognised pay cycle, how your earnings are going to be treated is completely discretionary. and you need to discuss your circumstances with either the Carers Allowance Unit or the Disability and Carer Service for Northern Ireland for further guidance and clarity, especially on how they want you to demonstrate your earnings. So they might be looking at things like your contract of employment. They might be looking at previous payment cycles. They might be looking at what's your expected payment cycles coming up. Is there any discernible patterns that can be identified from that? Okay. So this sometimes comes into play if you're on a 0 hours contract. Sometimes seasonal workers fall into this category. So it's very much about, you know, you need to have conversations with them before you are receiving any payments, because this can really help just minimize if you are going to be likely to have an overpayment or not. Completely different system for the self-employed. So we've been talking about earnings as an employee. If you're self-employed, it is completely different how these calculations are carried out. So if you are self-employed, the first thing that the Carers Allowance or Carers Disability Service will ask for, if you have a business, is your previous year's accounts. And normally they will take your previous year's accounts as their starting point for their calculations moving forward. If someone has a new business, or if there's been a major change in someone's trading pattern, okay, so the previous year's figures are no longer available or relevant. And this I have seen from experiences where a lot of people who have maybe had a business, now they're having to commit more to the caring role. They can't give as much to their business, so therefore they've had a reduction in income in the previous trading year. And so this is the kind of scenarios that you would then be falling into. Those previous trading year figures, they're no longer available. Do you know what I mean? They're not relevant. Okay. So if you've got a new business or you have had a major change in your trading pattern, you will be asked for details of your earnings and allowable expenses on an ongoing basis. So this could be monthly, it could be quarterly, and your calculations for your entitlement will be done on this very short time scale. This, however, does mean that you may have to submit 13 weeks accounts, have that processed, and then be paid 13 weeks carers allowance to tide you over the next 13 weeks. So it's like a payment in advance. Sorry, a payment in arrears. But you do know that you're eligible for it because that calculation has happened on your figures there. And again, I've included further information on how self-employment earnings are calculated at the end of this slide. Okay, and just a reminder that it is very different. Oh, it hasn't come up there, but just a reminder that how self-employment earnings are calculated for carers allowance is very different to how HMRC calculate your self-assessment. Okay, very two different systems at play here. Okay, so if you report your earnings to HMRC, this is not the same as reporting your earnings to the Carers Allowance Unit or the Carers Disability Service, and vice versa. You can't report your earnings to the Carers Allowance Unit and not do a self-assessment to HMRC. You have to do both. Okay. And I saw this in the chat box there. What happens if you go over the earning limits? Okay, so if you're over the net earning threshold for your particular pay period, your carers allowance will be suspended for an equivalent period. So if you go over for a month, your carers allowance will be suspended for the next month. Okay, this assumes that you have ongoing entitlement. Okay, so you didn't have entitlement last month, you're entitled this month, you had your payment last month, that will cover you your month that you're entitled. So it balances itself out there. You would be asked to provide proof that you were entitled the next month so that that payment would stand. In some cases, you may be asked to repay the amount of carers allowance received if there is no ongoing entitlement, for example. So you've started a new job, you've actually increased your hours. Because you increased your hours, you weren't entitled in that particular month. You still received your carer's allowance, but moving forward, you're actually going to be working more hours, so you're not going to have any ongoing entitlement. So then you will be asked to repay the carer's allowance for that original first period where you went over, because you've got no ongoing entitlement. And as very commonly known now, there is no sliding scale of entitlement, known as the earning cliff edge. 1 pence over the £151 a week, and you lose your entitlement for that week or that pay period, depending on when you get paid. And you may be aware as well that Carers UK and others such as Martin Lewis are campaigning for change for the current eligibility rules and administrative systems. There's a focus, among other things, to make carers aware in advance if they've gone over the earnings limits and to remove that cliff edge eligibility as well. Carers allowance is the only benefit in the welfare benefit system that has a cliff edge entitlement. Every other benefit has a sliding scale. This one doesn't. And if you want to know more about this, then I was just talking to Mari before. We're very happy to put some information out with the slides, but we need to just be really mindful that there was a lot of momentum, but then an election's been called. So everything is currently suspended and paused until after the election. And I just want to reassure you that actually, if you are facing an overpayment, please seek further advice as to next steps, because there is always something that we can do to help and support you, whether it's our organisation or another organisation, nearer to you. So that's what happens if you go over. So the best thing to do where we can, there we go, got it this time, is to try and prevent an overpayment. So wherever possible. Okay, so what can we do? Know and make use of all the allowable deductions you are allowed, because they can be your friend, enabling you to stay within the earnings limit. Okay, so when you first get your pay, everybody gets their gross pay, okay, for your employment, or your net profit. Okay, so if you are in employment or self-employment, we are looking very much around your net profit. So any profit you have after you have deducted your allowable deductions for carers allowance. Okay, so some of these are what you would expect. So any income tax you pay or any national insurance contributions you make, half of any of your contributions towards an occupational or personal pension. There is no limit to this. But the carers allowance unit or the carers disability service will need to see your pension premium paperwork. And it's really important to note that it is only your contribution that counts, not any payment the employer makes. Okay. So I've got a little example here. It's the simplest of examples, but it just really gives you the idea. So for example, you've paid any tax, you've paid any national insurance, and to be honest, on that level of income, you wouldn't have any tax or national insurance to pay, but for the sake of argument, we don't have those. You earn £155 a week. You won't be entitled to carers allowance. 155 is more than 151. No cliff edge, no sliding scale, no entitlement. However, if you put £20 a week into a pension, half of that £20 can be deducted from your earnings. So your earnings for carers allowance, therefore, would be 155 minus the 10, minus half of your £20 contribution, would give you an income of £145 a week. 145 is less than 151, therefore you can claim carers allowance and be paid it. Really simple example. But there is no limit to how much you can put into a pension. Remember, only 50% of your contributions will count, and it has to be evidenced. So not only do you need to evidence the payment you make, but you also have to evidence which pay cycle it sits in, so that the appropriate deduction can be made. Right. I've got a new computer and it just doesn't want to do what I want it to do. Okay, there is one final category, and this is known as care replacement costs. So if while you go to work, you have to pay someone to look after the person you care for, or you receive carer's allowance for, or you have a child under 16 who you or your partner get child benefit for, you can deduct those payments from your earnings up to half the value of your earnings after the other category deductions if they apply. Okay, so this one gets a little bit more complex because ultimately, you know, you could earn £300 a week. Okay, you have to pay someone to look after the person you care for. Up to the value of half of your earnings, you know, can be deducted. So say you're earning £300 a week, you could deduct up to £150 a week, which potentially could take you under the £151 a week. However, it is not as clear as what it would seem, because you cannot claim if the person you are paying is a close relative of either yourself or the person you're looking after. So a spouse, a partner, a civil partner, parent, son, daughter, brother, or sister. Okay, so you cannot pay grandma or your daughter or your son, an older sibling, to look after a younger child. Okay, so it has to be someone who I like to think who can invoice you. So do you have a carer or a care organization, or is it an after school club, or is it a nursery? You know, someone who can invoice you so you can pay that invoice, because all allowable expenses must be evidenced and you must show very clearly which pay period they apply to. And this is the same for if you are self-employed as well. Okay, so you have to have that evidence. Somebody has to have invoiced you or provided a receipt. And so if you did find somebody who you were paying to look after the person you're caring for, so your friend, for example, they would need to provide you with a receipt or an invoice. You would have to pay that. For them, potentially that might be classed as income. That could affect, you know, any benefits they're on, unless they're doing this as a business. If they're doing it as business themselves, what insurance do they have? So you can see it's sort of a self-perpetuating circle that we have there. Okay. There is something else that is useful to know. So there's one exception to the earnings rule. Now, it's a caring break. You can actually take a caring break for many different reasons. Okay, so for example, you want to go on holiday without the person you care for. Or it could be that actually you work in the hospitality industry, or you might work in a shop. Coming up to Christmas, you know it's going to be a very busy time, and you know there's going to be a chance to get some overtime. Okay. Now, if you know in advance, then you can use a carer's break to continue to receive payment of your carer's allowance or carer support payment alongside an increased wage. Okay. But again, you have to meet the entitlement of caring break. So it's very commonly used if people want to have a break from caring, want to step away, maybe go on holiday, maybe. But it's also a good tool to use if you know you are going to have a period of pay that is going to exceed the earnings limit. So any carer can have a break of up to 4 weeks in any 26 weeks caring. So that's 4 weeks every 6 months, 8 weeks in a year. And continue to be paid their benefit during these breaks. These breaks, as I've mentioned, can actually be for any reason. But prior to taking a break, you must have been providing your 35 hours of care for at least 22 weeks of the previous 26 weeks. Okay, and then if that person you're caring for has been in hospital, or you've been in hospital, that can also be included, even though you weren't providing that care. Okay, so if in the previous 6 months you've been looking after that person for at least 22 weeks, then you're entitled to accrue your 4 weeks caring break. Okay. Key things to note here. Okay. You have to notify them in advance that you are applying for a carer's break and the period you want it to start for. Therefore, you can't suddenly work a load of overtime 1 month, get a huge pay on the Friday, think, I'm going to ring carer's allowance unit on the Monday, I'm going to ask them to apply a caring break, everything is going to be good. It doesn't work like that. They have to know in advance. Okay. They're not very good at retrospectively applying things. The rules and regulations don't really allow it or give them a way to do that. Further complication, sorry. A caring week for carer's allowance and carer support payment start on a Sunday and they end on a Saturday. Most employee weeks start on a Monday and end on a Sunday. So again, there can be that disjointed overlap. The easiest way to think of it is that you have 4 weeks, 4 blocks of time where you can have a carer's break. And so it could be that your 1 week of employment might span 2 caring break blocks. So you have to sort of sit them alongside each other. And if you're struggling to do that, that is something the advice line can help you with. Okay, so caring weeks are different to working weeks generally, and are also different to our weeks because most people perceive the week starts on a Monday, ends on a Sunday, but for benefits, they start on Sundays and end on Saturdays. Okay. All right, let me just double check. Okay, I'll come back to those questions. So it's also really to be mindful of that apart from going over the earnings limit, is that changes of circumstance since you made the initial claim can impact your eligibility and result in overpayments. And this really commonly gets overlooked. Even the smallest change. Okay, so in no particular order, I've listed as many as I can. So if you start a job or you end a job, you go into education or you leave education, have any changes to your income, it goes up, it goes down, you have rental income suddenly, for example, you stop being a carer for any reason, the person you care for no longer gets their disability benefit for any reason, maybe their renewal hasn't gone through. Someone else who cares for the same person starts claiming carer's allowance instead of you. Remember, 2 people can't claim for the same person. Someone else who cares for the same person claims the carer's element of universal credit. That's that overlap there as well. 2 people cannot be assigned as a carer to the same person and receive monetary gain from that. Any kind of change to your immigration status if you're not a British citizen, okay, can impact entitlement. All of these things can result in overpayments. There are also some other things which may affect entitlement, which get overlooked. Okay, there's a lot more detail about these particular categories on our website, but as a really quick reminder, because we're trying to prevent overpayments here. Okay, if you travel abroad, it's got traveling abroad there, but actually if you travel in the UK as well, if you travel anywhere for a holiday and you don't go with the person you're caring for, okay, so you're not in your caring role, okay, you're not going to meet your eligibility for carer's allowance. Remember, you've got to be providing 35 hours a week care for that person. The person you're caring for goes into hospital and you're no longer providing care for at least 35 weeks. You can continue to receive your benefit for up to 12 weeks or until that person's disability benefit stops. Okay, person you're looking after goes into a residential care. Again, you're only able to claim carer's allowance if they continue to receive their benefits. Remember, your carer's allowance or carer's entitlement is linked to a person's disability benefit. That benefit stops, your entitlement stops. Or if the person you're looking after dies, will affect entitlement, but you will have an ongoing entitlement in that particular scenario. So you need to report all of your changes, okay, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant you think they are. So the easiest way, if you're in England, Wales and Scotland, is to do it online, or you can contact them by telephone. If you're in Northern Ireland, then it is by telephone only. But I would always say, in my experience, always keep a record of how you report any change. When you report this change, and if you do it by telephone, the name of the person you spoke to. Now, sometimes people go, hello, hello, or they don't go hello, hello, but they go, oh, hello, the DWP department, you're through to, and they say their name really quickly, and you might not have picked it up. Don't be afraid to re-ask them for their name at the end of the call, okay, or at the beginning of the call, you know, and just say you're just making a note of who you've spoken to, because you want to just make sure that these changes have been noted. And if you report your change, and if you have evidence you've reported your change, and there has been a delay in processing the change, which potentially means that you have continued to receive payments of carer's allowance you may not be entitled to, you have a stronger argument when you are challenging overpayments. Okay, so generally any overpayment you receive, you will have to repay, even if it wasn't your fault, even if you have reported a change. However, there are ways that you can ask for compensation. You can ask for longer periods of time. In some circumstances, you can ask for them to be written off, although it is not an automatic right. And so if you do have any details of an overpayment coming your way, it is really important that you seek advice. So I'm just going to quickly summarize what I've said there. Make sure you provide accurate information and answer all questions correctly when you make a claim. Contact them if anything looks wrong, or if you suddenly receive 2 lots of payments. Keep an eye on all of your earnings, okay? Take some time, work out what is your pay period in relation to a caring week. Give yourself a head start. You know, really think around, you know, do I need to be paying into a pension? You know, have I got allowable deductions that I can claim? Don't forget, caring breaks can be your friend. However, they have got to be requested in advance. And no matter how minor those changes may seem, please do report them all immediately or as soon as you can. Links to those regulations and legislations I alluded to earlier on. And also there's a link here to you. Can you help? Now, Carers UK, they're gathering carers' experiences of overpayments in relation to earnings. It can be submitted by carers, or if you've got an advisor that's working to support you, they can be done anonymously. And this is going to provide really important evidence of why we need change to make that system better. Okay, so there's a little link there, a little request for you. And then this just leads you to some further information around how you can access help and support, or you can contact the email line where myself and my colleagues work separately as well.